Before we start, if you enjoy this video, there are many more like it on the channel, with many more like it to come in the future, so if you enjoy, please subscribe, and also drop a like on the video. It helps me out a lot. This video is going to have a part 2 coming out tomorrow, so if you're interested in seeing all of my argument, you need to subscribe. Also, the NBA is shutting down because of I had to whisper that because you get demonetized for even mentioning it in your video. Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell have been confirmed infected, and I'm sure there are many more down the line. I don't have much to say, but it felt weird not to acknowledge it. I wish a speedy recovery to all the players and all of that. Wash your fucking hands. But yeah, today's video is on a topic that I have been sitting on for a while. And the reason for that is not that I'm afraid to piss off Jazz fans. I'm not scared of the Mormon Church at all. It's simply because I really had to do a lot of research to make my points, and I don't like doing research. For the most part, my videos are opinion pieces based on a combination of what I've seen and some stats. This video I had to dig into the depths to prove the point of something that I have felt for a long time, and that is that John Stockton is the most overrated player in NBA history. Because his numbers were inflated based off of the system that he was in. Those numbers did not contribute to winning in the ways that people seem to think they did, and those numbers vastly overstated the talent of John Stockton overall. This video took so much research, and also I'm sure this is going to get bombed in dislikes, so please drop a fucking like. So let's talk about why I feel Stockton is severely overrated. Since I mentioned the numbers that surround John Stockton that make him, in my opinion, overrated, let's talk about what those numbers are. John is often lifted up on all-time lists because of where he sits on the all-time assist and steals lists. He sits at number 1 in assists with quite a substantial separation between himself and number 2, with him having 15,806 assists, which is over 3,700 more assists than Jason Kidd at second place. And for the steals, he also sits at number 1 with 3,365 career steals, with once again a big lead ahead of the second with nearly 600 more steals than second place, which is again Jason Kidd. Now the reason I take issues with those numbers is because of two things. They are a product of longevity combined with the system that he played in, and because those numbers did not lead to winning on the highest stage as John proved throughout his career. Now the first thing I should explain with that, I feel, is the idea of the Jazz having a system. This might seem controversial to some, but I went back and looked for the evidence. The coach of the Jazz when Stockton was finally given a starting spot was Frank Layden, who liked to have an offense led by a playmaking point guard. When he became the head coach initially in 1981, he only had one point guard on the roster named Ricky Green. He was given the starting spot and jumped from 5 assists per game off of the bench to 8 assists per game with a 7-minute increase. He also went from 1.6 steals a game to 2.3. After marginal improvement after coming back to the NBA from overseas, suddenly Ricky was starting and leading the Jazz offense. This coming, by the way, after Ricky averaged just 4 assists per game in college, being pretty much just a scorer, averaging 20 a game both years in Michigan. But suddenly under Frank Layden, he's an assist man. Then he averages 9 assists a game for the next 2 years. He also averages an absurd 2.8 steals a game for those next 2 years, the latter being an all-star year for him. In that game, by the way, the announcer practically spelled out how Layden's system had impacted Ricky.
He has got super quickness. Everybody knew that, Ricky Green, when he first came into the pros, but he didn't have the outside shot. And it took a little patience by a coach like Frank Layden to put him in a system and give him his head to develop.
His numbers go down after the next couple of years, and eventually John Stockton overtakes him as the starting point guard and averages an absurd 14 assists per game. Now this was weird because previously John had been a great passer off of the bench for the Jazz, yes, but in college John was more of a scorer than a passer. In his senior year at Gonzaga, he averaged 21 points and 7 assists. 7 assists was good, of course, but it wasn't anything close to his peak 14.5 assists in the NBA. He also also cooled down his scoring in this starting role. 21 points on 57% shooting is quite insane for a 6'1" point guard, but in the NBA, his best scoring season was 17 points on 54% shooting, and that was with 38 minutes a game. So going into the NBA, Stockton was not projected as this generational passing talent. A good one, yes, but not nearly 9-time assist leading level passer. But when Stockton was put into an offense that favored pass-heavy point guards, this was the result. And Layden's defensive scheme also favored playing passing lanes, which is the same reason that Ricky Green averaged nearly 3 steals while playing at starting point guard for the Utah Jazz. Now, I'm not saying that Stockton didn't show signs of averaging a lot of assists and steals prior to him starting, because he did. His flashes off of the bench paired with the decline of Green is why he eventually even got the start. However, this was all happening with Frank Layden as the head coach of the Jazz, even when Stockton was on the bench. The Jazz drafted a guy who was 6'1", but still averaged 20 points on nearly 60% shooting in college and turned him into the assist guy, because that is the kind of offense that Layden preferred. They also took Ricky Green, who averaged 20 points in college and was considered the fastest player in the NBA, and turned him into a passer. Now, I'm sure you might be thinking, if you do know this, Frank Layden was not the head coach of the Jazz for the majority of John Stockton's career, which is true. However, the coach that followed Layden was Jerry Sloan, who was an assistant behind Layden, who Frank himself promoted because he stepped away from his position at head coach, being just the president of basketball operations. So yes, Frank Layden was not the head coach of the Jazz after John's first year, averaging 14 assists per game in the starting role. However, he was the mentor and employer of the guy who was the new head coach, a position that Frank gave away, feeling confident that Sloan would be able to replicate his system, which is what he did. Another huge factor in how John was able to accumulate so many assists was Adrian Dantley being traded and the Jazz fully committing to Karl Malone. Because when we're talking about assists, broadly speaking, it's when you pass to your teammate and they score. But of course, there's only a certain amount of time and a certain amount of moves that can happen before it's disqualified as an assist. Now, I say this because both Malone and Dantley were amazing at putting the ball in the basket. However, one did it in a way that generated a lot of assists, while the other, being Adrian Dantley, scored in the isolation, which meant when a guard would pass it to Dantley, he would catch the ball, do some jab steps, take a few seconds off of the clock, and then attack the basket. While Malone would catch the ball and go up with either a short jumper or 2 power dribbles inside on a majority of his possessions. The over-reliance on this system ended up showing its ugly head in the 98 finals when Jordan snuck behind Malone and stole the ball right as this exact play was happening. Weird how Jordan was able to anticipate that. But Adrian Dantley's play style, while generating a lot of points, did not really contribute to many assists. The Jazz, now that they had the young duo of Stockton and Malone, decided to trade him to Detroit in the late 80s, aka they traded him to the Bad Boy Pistons. And Dantley immediately pissed off Isaiah Thomas with his play style because it slowed down the offense significantly and often killed it. Thomas even saw an assist decline with Dantley in the starting lineup that rose back to normal once he was traded to Dallas. Him and Dantley actually had quite a bit of conflict from their clash in play style. Dantley also played similar to James Harden in that he had a heavy focus on drawing fouls, which is assist killing. Chris Paul saw a decline in assists playing with Harden, and Russell Westbrook has seen a steep decline in assists as well, from 11 last year to 7 this year. That's actually a pretty solid parallel. So the Jazz making this decision had a huge impact on where Stockton sits on all-time assist lists. So if the Jazz had decided to stick with their guns and keep Adrian Dantley and try and mix those three together, I guarantee you Stockton would have seen a significant hit on his assist totals. Speaking of Karl Malone, I think now is a good time to talk about the Stockton and Malone duo. There is this debate that can essentially be equated to the which came first, the chicken or the egg debate of the NBA, and that is the debate of who benefited more from the other, Stockton or Malone. And this debate is ridiculous to me because when you go back and watch the footage, it seems very apparent to me that not only is Stockton a significantly worse player than Karl Malone, but even more importantly, Stockton is benefiting way more from the duo than Malone is. Stockton was bordering on being a parasite in terms of their individual statistics. Their relationship could essentially be boiled down to the guy who throws the pass and the guy who scores. And I'm sorry, but scoring is a lot fucking harder than passing, so I think that makes that pretty clear. And the Jazz basically ran that system for almost 2 decades, with Utah making the foundation of their offense 2 plays, John passing it to Malone in the post, and then the 2 of them running a pick and roll. And if it wasn't that, it was a very basic catch and shoot mid-range shot for Malone and other players on the team. Which is why John got an insane amount of assists. The difficulty of the kind of passes that he was having to throw was very minimal when you compare it to other great passing point guards. I really feel that the footage is the most damning thing for John Stockton because of course the numbers on the surface look amazing, but of those 15,806 career assists, so many of them looked like this one.
Stockton with the ball front court left. He looks to Karl Malone. He's got him low. The mailman jumps it. Shot up. It's in. He did it. He did it. John Stockton to Karl Malone.
In case you were wondering why the crowd was freaking out so much about a very basic pass to a short jump shot with 3 minutes left in the quarter, well, that was the assist that John got that broke the record for most assists all time. Passing Magic Johnson. I find that hilarious. Now, I was interested to see what John Stockton's assist numbers looked like without Karl Malone. However, the 2 of them both had incredible durability. Malone has 10 seasons of 82 games played, 5 seasons of 81 played, and 2 of 80, and Stockton has, I kid you not, 16 fucking seasons playing all 82 games, with the lockout year in 1999 causing Stockton to play just 50 games, with just 49 for Malone, 50 games being the total regular season games played that year. The durability of these 2 is not brought up enough when talking about this duo, both as praise and criticism, because one, it's cool that you had that durability, but also how the fuck did you have that and then not win anything of significance? I mean, it's because John wasn't nearly as good as advertised, but you get my point. But let's look at the very few games that the 2 of them played without each other. Now, unfortunately, while in his prime, and I'm pretty sure for his career in general, John Stockton only played 3 games without Karl Malone. How is that even possible? And because of that, the numbers here really are not reliable because it is a 3-game sample size, but I guess I'll bring them up. He still averaged 14 assists, however, his scoring was down, which I didn't expect to find. Not down production-wise, he just shot horribly, and he averaged 4 turnovers a game, but it's nothing really noteworthy. That small of a sample size, you really can't draw a comparison one way or the other. Interestingly enough, the Jazz also, when you go and watch the highlights of his assists, had a lot of players outside of Malone that had that same capability to catch the ball and immediately go up in the post to fill that role when Malone was on the bench and Stockton still needed his easy fed to him assists. That's why some of the footage that I've shown so far has featured players doing that are not just Karl Malone. It's hard to find a trend based off of 3 games. However, with Malone, there is a substantial amount of games that he played without Stockton in the 1998 season. Now, I do not consider that to be prime Stockton, or at the very least, he wasn't used in the offense the same way, which is why he averaged just 8 assists per game that year, which will matter, but we'll talk about that later. However, I do think because there is that much of a sample size, it is worth looking at. There were 4 games that he played without Stockton previous to the 98 season, and the results of that were that he averaged 26 points, 9 rebounds, and 4 assists, shooting 53% from the field. Weirdly enough, he shot the ball 18 times in all 4 of those games, but those numbers are 3 less points per game and 2 less rebounds per game on the same efficiency, so not much to conclude there either. Now, as for those 1998 games, I'm going to be using Malone's numbers from 1993 to 1997 as the controlled group because it feels disingenuous to compare it to his earlier years where he was putting up 29 and 30 a game. But let's see what Malone did in the 18 games that Stockton did not play in 1998. In those games, Malone put up 25 points, 11 rebounds, 3.6 assists, and 3.6 turnovers on 52% shooting. Comparing that to 93 through 97, that is 1 less point, 1 less rebound on 1% worse shooting, and 0.8 less turnovers. So really, we're seeing that Malone's scoring was only slightly impacted expected when Stockton was not playing. In the biggest sample size, he averaged 1 less point and 1 less rebound. Stockton, in his small sample size, averages the same assists, same points, but his efficiency is way worse. I think maybe that's because he had to handle more of the scoring load in that scenario. However, I don't think those numbers really show anything other than Malone really did not need Stockton to create his offense. He probably had some benefit, but it was not significant. He certainly had enough of a sample size, I think, to prove that he did not need Stockton. Those numbers did not point to a whole lot, but it took a fuck ton of time for me to look it all up, so it's going in the damn video. Also, I was going to look into the notion that John had home cooking in Utah, basically implying that he got more assists at home than he did on the road. However, when I started to look into it, the difference was not that monumental. There was a season where he averaged almost 2 more assists at home. However, 1, players generally play better at home, and 2, the same thing applies to Chris Paul, Steve Nash, Jason Kidd, all those other guys. That's just kind of how it is. Scorekeepers record more assists for the home team. It's pretty fickle, but that's the same standard that every other player goes by, so you can't really single out Stockton for it. But my main point so far, and the second biggest reason why I feel Stockton is the most overrated player of all time, is that John's assist totals far outweigh the actual talent of passer that Stockton was. What I consider a great passer to be is someone who makes passes that most people cannot see, that 99% of players cannot see. That's the mark of a great passer. But when I watch Stockton, he is a good passer, not a great one, and certainly not the guy who should be on top of the all-time assist list. There are many passes among those 1,500 career assists that are great passes, but that's just kind of guaranteed to happen when you have that many assists. It's not something that he does consistently. There are many passers that I would take over Stockton, which is important because of how much of Stockton's all-time ranking placement is based off of his assist totals. So far I have made the point that John played in a system that favored passing guards, and the pairing with Karl Malone gave him basically an assist factory in Utah. And I have made the point that Karl Malone barely benefits from the relationship while Stockton is able to have his placement on the all-time assist list. But my next point is the most valid reason for why I feel Stockton is overrated, and a lot of great passing point guards are overrated, and that is that he represents possibly the most flawed concept in the history of basketball, and that is the concept of a true point guard. And I'm going to elaborate on that in my next video, The Truth About True Point Guards. That's right, this is a two-parter like I said. The idea of a true point guard has been flawed ever since its inception, and I wanted to talk about that in a whole separate video for a long time, so I figured I would pair both of these videos together to make a two-parter. It's going to talk about true point guards in general and then end on rounding it out about John Stockton. So if you want to see my final conclusion about why I feel Stockton is the most overrated player in NBA history, you're gonna have to watch that video. So subscribe for that, drop a like, and cue the outro music.